No spoilies. No spoilies.
Bramble the Mountain King is pretty much just Little Nightmares but in a different setting. That's the thought that stuck with me throughout my various playthroughs of the game, yet it evidently didn't ever stop me from seeing a new game through to the end. Whilst Bramble might just be another entry in the small child versus big scary world category, it does most everything right and has put enough effort in to grant itself something of an identity. It's just that its roots and inspirations are very much clear. The small child versus big scary world subgenre has been on the rise in the last decade within the horror space, with games like Playdead's Limbo blazing the trail for small indie atmospheric puzzle platformers. Following that, we had Inside by the same studio, which was a clear evolution of Limbo's formula, exchanging the 2D visuals for 3D, adding in extra mechanics, and offering more of a narrative for the player to engage with. Not that either game ever directly tells the player anything, rather they convey their stories through their worlds and set pieces and pretty much leave them to figure it all out themselves. They make use of ambiguity, which allows the audience to piece together the events at their own pace and draw their own conclusions, and of course decide on their own level of immersion. There may have been more in the intermediate years, I can't say for certain, but then came the likes of Little Nightmares, which was a massive evolution of this style of game. Not only was horror a more prevalent theme, but also Little Nightmares allowed the player to explore full 3D environments. It really upped the ante when it came to visual storytelling and monster design, and it gave the player a few more consistent mechanics and interesting obstacles to overcome. Said obstacles often came naturally as a result of us playing as a tiny, frightened child trying to survive in a world larger than them. Then Little Nightmares 2 came along, offering a world even larger than that, and an AI companion that never got in the way and was always helpful when present. In fact, the moments when we become separated from 6 in Little Nightmares 2 make us feel all the more alone and vulnerable because we're used to having someone else around us in the game, so it feels more impactful when we don't have that person there. There was also a game called Guilt that apparently did the same small child scary world thing, but it was a Stadia exclusive, and with it being discontinued earlier this year, it's currently unavailable, so I can't judge it or discuss what it brought to the formula. If it is ever ported to other platforms though, you can bet that I'll be there. My point is that this kind of game has seen more attention over the last 10 years, and it's hard to say whether it's because the developers of such games want to provide for a niche audience, or if these games are just a lot easier to make. It's a very basic trope in horror to include a child, because unless you're a psychopath or a politician, for all the fucking difference that makes, you'll feel worse for a kid stuck in a nightmarish hellscape than you would for an adult, and the use of ambiguity could simply be done because the game devs didn't want to write a proper story, or maybe just lacked the talent to do so. That's a cynical take on the matter, I admit, and even though the industry as a whole doesn't deserve the benefit of the doubt, I'll extend it here and assume that Bramble the Mountain King was made the way it was because the team behind it are passionate about providing this sort of experience for their audience. Bramble in some ways feels like it wanted to be the next big step forwards in the small child scary world mold, but the question is whether the game is a positive step in the right direction or if it's an evolutionary dead end. So that's what we're going to talk about. Let's review Bramble the Mountain King. As you've no doubt concluded, Bramble the Mountain King is one of those small child lost in big scary world type games, though it has more of a Nordic theme as its enemy encounters in its world are all based around old Nordic fables. I'm not familiar with such folklore outside of trolls. I did occasionally look on Google just to see if the creatures the game depicts were meant to be that way, and everything seems to be in order based on my collective 90 seconds of research. The game will feel very familiar if you're a fan of this subgenre. Specifically, if you've played Little Nightmares, then it's pretty much just that but with an outdoors theme. You control a small child named Oli and must navigate a huge hostile world by solving puzzles and avoiding the various nasties that want to make you into their dinner or just otherwise that want you dead. One of the most notable evolutions to the formula is the ability to defend yourself directly. Early on we're taught that we can throw things at targets in a sequence where Oli and his older sister Lilymore toss a glowing stone they found back and forth, and it's worth mentioning now that the targeting is very generous. As long as you aim vaguely towards the thing you're trying to hit in one of the game's designated throwing sections, then you'll lock on and the hit is a guarantee. When I say designated throwing sections, I'm not being entirely accurate, as you start out throwing the glowing rock back and forth, then later you transition to hunks of gore, then after that it's some pebbles, but after a time the glowy rock is blessed by a young lass named Tolva? I forget how her name is supposed to be pronounced, it doesn't matter. And then instead of being thrown, it generates a flash of light. I can't deny this does undercut the feeling of helplessness by quite a significant margin. It might be a cheap trick making it so your character can't fight back, but you can't deny it's effective for making you feel vulnerable as you explore a world that wants to kill you. If you physically cannot fight back for whatever reason, then yeah, the world you're in will seem a lot more hostile, though given the protagonists of the small child scary world games are always children, then I kind of buy that they're not exactly about to stone cold kill the monsters that are after them, unless they're from Texas of course. By giving a us this ability to directly attack, we do lose that sense of vulnerability, but I can't deny it feels like an ultimately positive evolution of the formula. Bramble the Mountain King makes the combat mechanics work because they don't always work. That was a weird sentence, I admit. Before we get the gem, we're very much at the mercy of the world around us, and even after we get the gem that we can shoot magic out of, we'll encounter some creatures who aren't affected by the light or who are actively drawn to it. In fact, in a later stage where we must traverse a village of undead, we must use the stone to see in the dark houses that we need to duck in and out of, but doing so will attract the attention of the undead if we're not careful, so we can't just hold it up constantly. The burst of light that we can attack with is completely ineffective against them and will only wind up getting brutally killed by the shamblers if we try to fight back. By making combat an approach that just doesn't always work, or by having us face situations where we're unable to engage in it, the game largely manages to keep that feeling of being a small and easily preyed upon thing, because hey, turns out not everything is physically harmed by a fucking flashlight. There aren't really any other major mechanics to speak of that we haven't seen before. We can sprint, we can crouch, though we cannot grab loose objects freely anymore. It's all contextual now, which I think was a questionable choice. It now makes most puzzle challenges extremely straightforward because anything we can interact with has a white dot right above it that stands out against the dark environments. Most of the puzzles we encounter are incredibly one note. Usually it's just interacting with all the interactable things or using the light attack to clear away the brambles that are blocking our path. The most difficult thing in the latter case is just remembering to face the right way. There are two moments where there's a door locked behind a magical seal that we need to break by mixing a potion, which sounds a lot more interesting than it is. Really all we're doing is matching 4 shapes to open the way, and this just feels really out of place. For lack of a better phrase, these segments feel really video gamey, and the same can be said of the world itself. I will say the game's world looks expansive and gorgeous, but the actual path you're on is so linear that in many places the game uses invisible walls to keep the player on track. You can clearly see here that I should be able to clear this gap in a single bound, but bumped against an invisible wall at the edge there. Or here, this debris has no reason not to be climbable, but instead we have to stack books to reach a climby bit because video games. Or here, where I cannot walk this way because there's a hefty chunk of nothing blocking me. I'm just gonna say it, invisible walls like these are a complete design cop-out and a total detriment to my immersion. Just design your environment so it makes a logical sense why I cannot go the way I'm going. If you can't think of a reason why a small pile of easily climbable rubble is unscalable or need to employ an invisible wall to keep a jumpable gap unjumpable, then maybe make the obstacle something different or just make the rubble/gap bigger. As I said, it's something that I find affects my immersion. I'm no longer in the dark, grim world of Bramble when I hit that invisible wall. I'm now keenly aware that I'm sitting in my lonely flat playing video games surrounded by empty Dr. Pepper bottles and half-assembled Lego sets. Something else that feels distinctly video gamey would be the boss fights. Your opponents are all slow and predictable with long delays between their actions that make it all too easy to beat them. This boss here, the Pester, might look really worrying when she abducts you into a dark void and spits rats at you, but she'll only take you here 3 times, and each time all you have to do is hit her in the eyes 4 times with your light and then you're released. You might die the first time when she appears as the floor and eats you, or because you misjudged the distance of her rake attack, but it doesn't take long for the patterns to become obvious, and ultimately the whole encounter was just a drag. In general, the gameplay is a mixed bag. I can appreciate the ways the game tried to build on what came before it, but I don't think enough was done to make the most of the mechanics, and it often felt like they took the safe route. I called what the game has combat, but that's a generous use of the word. To be fair, these games don't typically thrive on such mechanics because, as I said earlier, usually the player character is left to outsmart their giant opponents, so the combat is an interesting addition, but it isn't particularly impressive, and most boss fights offer very generous checkpoints, so if you fuck up, you don't have to run all the way back to them just to have another go. To be fair, frequent checkpoints are sort of another staple of the genre, and whilst I will say it might undermine some of the tension in the long run, I admit it's a nice convenience to have, given that most of the bosses really aren't that interesting when you get right down to it. I think the best boss fight is the one at the very end of the game, partly because he feels like a combination of most everything we've seen up to now, so it feels like you're really using everything you've learned across your adventure, but mostly because I like the music. He is still quite slow to attack, his patterns take minimal time to learn, and thanks to the generous auto-lock on, it's pretty easy to take the dude down, but I do enjoy the spectacle of the fight, so props there. I usually died because I misjudged the distance between me and the edge of the arena, or because a rock fell on me because I got distracted by my phone making a noise. Still, I prefer the monster encounters to some of the traps in the world, because at least with the monsters, I can see what killed me clear as day. In some places, there are drops that have no reason to be fatal. There's an early section in the forest where the game will just spawn in bear traps to kill you if you try to walk on the ground. around. Seriously, they literally just teleport in. The ones I walk into clearly aren't there beforehand, and I will say it's pretty clear when a game is just copying the former game's playbooks without really evolving the concepts. There's this bit where there's a hidden nasty beneath some gore that we need to move through, and we can avoid it by climbing on top of things for temporary safety. Actually, they do that bit twice, once with gore and later with water, which you might recognise from Little Nightmares. There's a bit where we need to hide from something in the tall grass, like in Little Nightmares 2, the main difference being that we get grabbed, not shot if we get spotted. There are two sections where we need to take cover from shockwaves as we did in Inside. Now, I'm not complaining that the game uses the foundation of these games that came before it, I am just a little disappointed that it didn't really build on them, it just sort of threw them in to pad out certain sections. Still though, I don't want to sound too negative because I do like the game for the most part. It might not be the most original thing, gameplay wise, but all of these bits it smashes together do work and are welcome additions, invisible bear traps notwithstanding. The game also does visuals and sound effects really nicely. The world goes from a vibrant liveliness to a bleak beauty over the course of the adventure. The sound direction is on point with fine tracks that can either build the tension or ease your frayed nerves as you explore. Graphically speaking, everything's really good, though I don't care much for Oli's facial design. I find him weirdly creepy to look at, but that's a problem I have with kids in games most of the time. I guess the devs don't want to Google children for references, otherwise they'd probably end up on some sort of watch list. Oddly though, his sister Lilymore doesn't have the same problem in that she doesn't look like she fell face first into the uncanny valley, but I accept that this might just be a me issue. Still, overall the game looks fantastic, with generally good and detailed character and world design, and each boss that we meet looks rather nasty and imposing, and all have a solid soundtrack to add to the tension of their encounters. The game really knows how to present itself, and that's always worth a high five. So what about the story though? I feel like we should probably stand to have a look in that direction at some point, right? How does Bramble, the Mountain King, who I certainly didn't vote for, convey its narrative? The game opens in the bedroom of Oli and Lilymore, Oli having just awoken from his sleep to find that his sister has left him alone. In this section you've got to interact with all the interactable objects in order to move forward, and I'm not entirely sure why. Personally, I think that just going over to the obviously open window with the sheet rope tied around it should be enough to progress, but that doesn't even spawn as an option until you've interacted with everything else. One of the interactables is a book on the table that tells the story of a young girl wandering off into some woods, only they get darker and more hostile the deeper she goes until she's faced with a monster, foreshadowing Oli's own journey. By the way, this is when I want to bring up the narration and how unnecessary I think it is to proceedings. When I did my first impressions video not that long ago, I was very uncertain about the narration, not because of the quality of the performance, but simply because I just didn't feel like we needed it. In my next playthrough a week later, I had the narration turned off, and yeah, it was a much more enjoyable experience. Wordless storytelling is something that video games feel almost uniquely equipped to deliver, because whilst you can have movies with minimal to no dialogue which can work, the video game as a medium offers a more direct level of interactivity. Hell, just look at former examples of this type of game, from Limbo to Inside to the Little Nightmares games. No one is narrating, but the game still managed to deliver their narratives and, of course, could use ambiguity to their advantage. What I'm getting at is, narration feels like a step backward, and I feel like the developers knew this because the game has the option to completely disable the narration if you want, and I personally recommend doing that if you're going to go through the game. It feels just a little too hand-holdy for my tastes. Maybe they were aiming for a storybook approach, but if that's the case, then the narration feels too infrequent and sometimes just random as hell, popping up and completely demolishing the tension or the emotion that the scenes themselves worked so hard to create. Anyway, let's get on with the story. Oli, being more afraid of being alone in the darkness outside, follows his sister's trail into the woods and meets her at some nearby ruins. They find a glowing gemstone and toss it around to one another as sort of a game, but one throw is so bad that it completely breaks the laws of physics. I threw the stone away from the ledge that they jumped towards in this scene, but oh well. And the two go to grab it, but the ledge gives out and they fall. Don't worry, they're both okay. What follows is a short but pleasant stroll through the woods where we meet some little gnomes and play a game of hide and seek. We also help one old gnome dude wrangle whatever the hell these creepy things are. After a little while, Lilymore, who keeps running ahead of us, gets captured by a troll and we're forced to flee before we get grabbed too, leading to the two becoming separated and Oli being left to go on a mission to rescue his sibling. The section that follows sees Oli have to navigate a forest full of traps and eventually come face to face with a troll butcher who wants to kill us, and often kills me because I fuck up the jump. This fight isn't too hard though, all you have to do is dodge the cleaver and then jump when he smacks the ground so you don't get stunned. Then throw some gore in his eyes and he buggers off. He just leaves, you're free to go. Once we get past the butcher, we help some little gnome dudes out of a cage, and then as we're getting them back to their house, another troll happens upon it and smashes their house to bits as Oli whines and panics like a little bitch. I'm sorry, that was rude. To be fair to the little dude, that's got to be some rough shit to have to deal with. This section leads to the bit where we have to avoid the troll's lanterns or we get grabbed and killed. We wind up getting captured anyway after we stumble into one of their kitchens and decide that walking in the open is probably the best idea. We get put into a cage and escape rather easily, and then Oli finds that glowing stone from earlier. He then gets grabbed by another troll, but before it can be eaten as a midnight snack, the gem glows and the troll turns into stone. It's worth pointing out now that aside from some basic vocalizations like grunts of exertion and pain, Oli doesn't really talk at all, nor does he scream or really do anything to verbally react to what's going on. The most he does is sort of sound like he's crying. You can tell the devs tried to make him emote, but it never quite sticks to landing. Anyway, the troll is bested and we climb out of its hands and press onwards. This next section is peaceful and serene, with a delightful background theme playing as we take a little hedgehog ride across a river. Ah, how pleasant. We then help a little gnome get back to its pa, and yes, all the gnomes do share the same two character models because reasons. Then we travel for a dark cave and come across a lake, which is home to a sinister creature who's playing an alluring musical tone which it uses to draw in its prey. We need to jump from lily pad to lily pad to evade the creature, then shield our bodies from their violent tunes of death. Great, another nice day ruined by some dickheads playing their music too loud. Oli doesn't so much defeat the monster though, as he does fall into a river and get swept over a waterfall as the monster leaps after him. Not the sharpest knife in the pencil case that one, but this leaves Oli wounded, and after shambling forwards, he encounters a girl in white named Tolva who heals his wounds and blesses his stone. I don't know if she's a being from Nordic folklore. I Google searched her and it kinda got nothing, so I'm just going to assume she's an original creation. Before we get healed though, Oli has a dream about those ruins we played in earlier getting tangled up by some of the game's titular Bramble. If you have the narration on, you'll be told that the Bramble is basically this game's version of generic darkness, and it covers the land, and it all stems from a mountain in the distance where we can find Lilymore. So off Oli heads. He has a nasty encounter with a flower that will send Bramble to kill him if it sees him, but luckily he's saved by a rocky giant troll creature thing that he helped earlier by getting rid of some angry pine cones that were trying to kill it. Or just dancing on top of it. I forgot to actually mention that earlier. That's a thing that happened. But hey, friendship for the win. Once he's past that whole mess, he gets to contend with a witch and the souls of the children that she straight up killed, and she has another baby in hand and she's about to do the same thing there. Blimey, this took a turn. The witch herself never attacks us, instead a hellish midwife who tends to the dead kids does, as Oli attempts to reach the witch before she completes a nasty ritual that a nearby book tells us about. Unfortunately, he's too late, but he does give the baby a proper burial so it doesn't become one of the Dark Souls, and hey, plus 10 points for the game saying the words Dark Souls if you've got the narration on here. After this grim section, Oli doesn't even have time to breathe before an illusion of his sister leads him to the lair of a shape-shifting monster, and thus we're faced with one of the game's more interesting boss encounters. Oli must duck behind trees, leap over waves of blood, and target nearby corpses that the creature seems to be drawing power from, and here he learns to harness his aggression and turn his gem into a blade of pure light that he can stab the creature's heart with. After the third round of dodging blood magic and destroying corpses, the shapeshifter is weakened and he moves in for the kill. If you like, you can just keep hitting the button and stab over and over again. I did this for nearly 5 minutes straight just for a laugh, and I got a trophy called Murderer as a result. To be fair though, if you don't know that missing the prompts is how you're supposed to progress, then you probably would just sit here stabbing away awkwardly. After this section, we need to duck through a town of zombies that the shapeshifter used to prey upon, so much so that the town killed all of the women who looked even vaguely similar to her, and then to add salt to the wound, they ended up suffering a nasty plague which caused the rest of them to die and the dead to rise from their graves. After making our way through the ruins of the town, evading the corpses at all costs, we end up in a chase scene, but luckily the bridge that we escape over collapses and it takes the horde with it. We then climb a tower, illuminate a big gemstone with our little gemstone, and then after descending and taking a rowboat towards the mountain, we're met by the Pester, who is the embodiment of the plague that destroyed that town. She drags us to the Shadow Realm, but there's no time to see if playing a children's card game will get us anywhere, as she spits rats at us, tries to rake us, or just spit water at us. She also tries to eat us. The bitch. All you've got to do is survive 3 of these instances, and then you banish her. It's that simple, really. We're now right by the mountain, and after visiting those ruins from the early game, which I think might have been a hallucination or a dream sequence, we wind up inside the mountain itself. During that ruins bit, we cast away to Bramble and the narrator tells us that Oli is sad about the sad things he saw. Thanks lady, never would have guessed that. If you're wondering, the big evil looking mountain here formed around a king who became cruel after his only son died from a sickness. He was cursed by a witch to be entombed within the mountain and forced to eat children as punishment. I mean, I'm no expert on magical judgment, but it feels like there's a lot more people being unjustly punished by this arrangement. Don't get me wrong, the king became a massive shit. He didn't heed the warnings of the witch who initially helped him find a cure for his son and then went on to do a witch genocide, but as bad as it has to be to eat children, I feel like the kids here are the ones getting kinda screwed over for no good reason. Also, that might not even be effective as a punishment because the king might enjoy eating children and then that's a whole new problem to deal with. To be fair though, this is the sort of shit old fairy tales used to pull, so I can't deny it feels authentic. We arrive in the chambers of the king just in time to see Lilymore eaten whole, and then Oli battles the king and eventually frees him from the brambles entangling him. That reminds me, the brambles were part of that whole curse thing the witch put on him. They held him here and basically spread like a plague of their own over the years because the king was very naughty. Again though, feels like a lot more people are going to suffer as a result of the punishment, but then again, who am I to argue with how magical creatures do justice? After the battle is done, Oli throws the gem into the king's mouth as he rises, sending the boy falling to his death in the process. Lilymore then uses the gem's light blade to cut her way out of the now deceased giant king, and then uses the final bit of light the gem has to bring Oli back to life. The two then escape the collapsing mountain with the help of the giant friend that Oli made earlier. Afterwards, we play a brief scene of Lilymore awakening from a nightmare, only now Oli has gone for a stroll in the night, him appearing at the window shortly afterwards, having overcome all of his fears. Now, it's possible that everything we just did was a dream or a nightmare more likely. It's a possibility. The narrator never explicitly tells us whether it is or not, so I'll give the game the benefit of the doubt that everything we just did was real. It's an odd story, not particularly impressive when it's all laid out before us, but I guess it wasn't really bad. I think there was a bit too much crammed into a short runtime. The game's between 3 and 4 hours long, depending on how quickly you move and how many times you die. Well, I guess a complaint I do have is that it's a bit cliche. We're saving a sibling from a monster, which has been done to death across creative media for years. It's also not delivered very well, thanks again to the unnecessary narration that feels so oddly out of place. Look, I'm not CinemaSins. I don't think narration on its own is a bad thing, but there's an art to its inclusion that Bramble seems to have failed to understand. I feel like the game wanted to have something of a storybook approach, but then maybe it should have gone a lot harder. Maybe open with the story and then move on to how our characters fit into that story. Maybe the game was worried that it wouldn't know how to communicate that we need to reach the mountain without the narration, but I can think of a few ways. Well, one way. Show the troll heading towards the mountain after it kidnapped Lilymore. It's not rocket science, is it? It almost sounded like the game was making it up as we went along, which granted is how storytelling works, but a good plot naturally moves from beat to beat. It should never just feel like you put a bunch of random ideas into a blender. I loudly sighed when the village of zombies rolled around because zombies in video games have been so overdone by this point that I've completely lost interest in them. But the story ends alright enough. Oli grows as his journey forces him to confront the darkness of the world around him, and he saves his older sister, ultimately through his own self-sacrifice. It's not a bad story, it's also just not a very good story. It's pretty much smack bang in the middle where it wasn't good enough to have me leaning forward and salivating, nor was it bad enough to annoy. It's fine. It's just fine. There were a few things I forgot to mention, most inconsequential, but then there's this dude here, the Lichtguben, who shows up twice to guide us to an otherworldly library just so we could read some stories. This is the only way the game has to tell us about the Mountain King, and I'll be honest, I don't care if it's an accurate depiction of this creature's abilities and lore, it's not a great way to communicate the narrative to the player. It's something that bugged me and I nearly forgot to mention entirely because these brief segments are pretty forgettable. Other than that, the story, I've already said it, it's fine. It's still just fine.